Well, hello and welcome to Design Emergency Podcast. I'm Alice Rawsthorn, co-founder of Design Emergency with Paola Antonelli. And in each episode of Design Emergency, we explore innovative design solutions to complex problems. And on this episode, we'll discuss design's impact on one of the most troubled areas of many societies, the dire condition of our prison systems, recently described by The Economist as being caught in a doom loop. We're doing this with the British criminologist Yvonne Jewkes, who's visited over 100 prisons around the world to discover why they're failing, how they can be improved, and what contribution design can make to that process. Yvonne is Professor of Criminology at the University of Bath, where she also teaches in the School of Architecture. In parallel with her academic work, she has advised on the design of new correctional facilities in the UK, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand. Yvonne explores the challenges confronting our overcrowded, underfunded, and often understaffed prisons in her recently published book, An Architecture of Hope, while drawing on her research and practical experience to propose how design can help to make prisons fit for purpose in the future. So Yvonne, beginning at the beginning, when did you first become interested in prisons?
I never really was, to be honest, Alice. And thank you for inviting me onto this podcast, by the way. Yeah, my interest was actually in media. I did a master's degree at the University of Leicester in what was then called mass communications research. And I was very interested in audience studies that were coming out in the 1990s. And one of the most interesting things to me was that television viewing was strongly gendered. So in most households at that time, it was the male head of the household who decided what would be watched on television, followed by male children, and then female children, and then last of all, the woman of the household, even if she had paid work outside the home. And I was very interested in these power relationships and how power flows in these ways. And it got me wondering what it would be like in an all-male environment. How would media access be negotiated there? So I started to think about prisons. And I'd heard anecdotally that TV rooms were flashpoints in prisons. At that time, televisions were in association rooms. So you might only have one TV on an entire landing. And it just interested me, the thought of how access was negotiated. Who decided whether we're all going to watch the football or we're going to watch Coronation Street, So that was where my interest stemmed. But I think prisons get under your skin. After the first time that I visited a prison, and I've heard other people say this as well, they get under your skin in quite an interesting way. And I think that's because they are so full of humanity in all its extremes. So yes, you do have pockets of violence and despair and desperation, but there's also a huge amount of kindness and courtesy and lots of humour in prisons as well.
And when did you realise that design played such an important role in determining the success or failure of prisons?
Straight away, actually. I think it's impossible to enter a prison and not be immediately aware of the role that architecture and the fabric of the buildings play in the administering of punishment. In the mid-19th century, prisons were designed to facilitate a penal experiment, which was called the separate system. So Victorian-era prisons were built on a hub-spoke template that we're all very familiar with now, very, very much like Bentham's panopticon. And they had small cells that were intended for single occupancy, arranged along landings, usually 3, 4, or 5 stories high. And inmates were kept apart. They were kept separate, really in order to encourage them to reflect on their wrongdoings and show penitence. And that's where we get penitentiary from. So they were not allowed to exercise together or fraternize in any way. When prisoners left their cells, they had to wear masks or hoods. And the architecture was really the embodiment of this ideal. And of course, it was eventually abandoned, largely due to public disquiet, actually, because of the high levels of mental illness and suicide, self-harm, and so on, that were caused by the separate system. But we still have thousands of prisoners in those Victorian era prisons. And many of them are now sharing cells that were designed for sole occupancy.
And obviously there are many factors, not just problems with poor design, that have contributed to the current crisis in prisons. Why are the prison systems in so many countries currently in crisis, and what's the impact on prisoners and prison staff? Are we looking at a crisis of the same proportions as the one you just alluded to?
Yeah, I think we are. I mean, to try and describe the crisis that prisons are currently in, it's such a huge issue. It's a massive question. For my entire career, we've been talking about the fact that prisons are in crisis. But it feels as if at this point in time, we've really reached almost the end of the road. And I think the government are realising that. But I think in answer to your question, in many countries, broadly speaking, there has been a political shift to the right and to philosophies of punishment that embody ideas around deterrence and retribution in particular. So I think we've largely abandoned ideas about treatment and rehabilitation. I know governments talk about the need for prisons to both punish and rehabilitate, but of course, they're actually mutually exclusive goals. I don't believe that you can do both. And even countries famed for their liberal approach to punishment are experiencing versions of this crisis, I think, and this move to a more sort of right-wing position. And the result, which has caused the crisis, is an increase in sentence length and severity, an over-reliance on prisons as the default setting when it comes to punishment. I think it's also led to a consequent commitment to keep trying to build our way out of the crisis. This is something that politicians talk about a lot. And one of the factors involved in that is that we are building prisons on the cheap. Of course, architects call this value engineering. And that means that designs are being stripped back, and anything that softens the environment or makes it more aesthetically pleasing or more beautiful in any way gets vetoed, often on security grounds. So in recently built prisons in this country, for example, they very often won't have any trees or much green space. And that means there's no wildlife either. They can be quite sterile, sort of industrial scale and very institutional feeling places. And the consequence for prisoners and staff is that they're either living and working in ancient Victorian jails that that haven't been fit for purpose for many decades, or they're in these newer human warehouses to all intents and purposes.
And could you identify design's contribution to this crisis and describe the principal design errors that currently impede the efficiency of prisons?
Yeah, I don't think efficiency is the problem, actually. An efficient prison would be one that has prisoners locked up for 23 hours a day, probably, and it would just, tick along quite nicely.
I was thinking of efficiency in the broadest sense, in that I would have thought an efficient prison would be one that releases prisoners who are significantly less likely to reoffend.
Yes, that would be great. Yeah, I mean, I think in many, many European countries, 1% of the build costs of any big capital project, including prisons, has to be spent on art and sculpture. And I think, I just believe that art is a civilizing force, really. So that would be great. But I think in general, some of the problems are we're building very large prisons. In the 1960s, a prison holding 400 people would have been considered very large. Now we're routinely building prisons that hold 1,700 to 2,100 people, and they never feel like human scale, humane, healing places. I think also future-proofing is a problem. We tend to build prisons to a higher security spec than is actually required. So we build prisons to category B specifications, which is high security, even though they're going to hold category C, medium security prisoners. And the rationale for that is that if at some point in the future those buildings have to hold higher security inmates, it avoids the need for expensive retrofitting of security paraphernalia. But in practice, that's never happened. And in design terms, again, that makes for a very kind of institutional feel. You can't walk more than a few paces without another gate having to be unlocked. So, things like that impact the design and quality of life, I think. There are others as well, designing for one purpose and then using a prison for another. In my book, An Architecture of Hope, I give the example of Wirry Prison in New Zealand, in Auckland, which was designed for long-term prisoners. And the idea was that the design had a progression and regression model built into it. So the prison was designed in a sort of semicircle, and prisoners would start off in basic accommodation, but through compliance and good behaviour, they would get sort of pulled through the accommodation, which would get better and better at each stage. But crucially, they could see ahead of them. They could see independent housing units at the end. They could see accommodation with five-a-side football pitches and that kind of thing, and gardens and allotments and things. And so I thought it was a really clever model because, prisoners immediately understood that if they behaved themselves, their quality of life would improve. They would be going to sort of better designed accommodation. But the problem was the prison system in New Zealand got overfilled, and they ended up stuffing that prison full of remand prisoners. And then, of course, the progression regression model doesn't work because they're just in the prison for a short amount of time and then they get shipped out. And then also New Zealand has quite a bad gang problem. And so certain prisoners had to be kept apart. And all the good design cues were severely compromised as a result.
So what needs to happen to rectify these errors, to stop repeating them and to address them should they recur? Is it just money, or is it a complete shift in policy and the way that society views prisons and their role within it?
Yeah, I think that's a very astute question. And I think that the last bit that you said is what we should be doing. In practical terms, I think we need to abandon our commitment to the prison as the only way of punishing people. In my view, prison should be a last, not a first resort. And it should only be used for people who are violent or a threat to society. So if we look at women in prison, for example, most women in prison are in for offences like shoplifting, very often shoplifting of nappies and baby formula, that kind of thing, or non-payment of fines. Only about 15% of women are in for violent offences. Now, even if we took that 15% figure at face value and assume that those crimes weren't committed in self-defence, you'd be talking about a prison population of about 350 women. And in design terms, we could really do something interesting then for those women. So, for example, Scotland is a bit more enlightened than England and Wales in this respect. They have recently started to build community custody units. And if any of your listeners are interested, I'd urge them to look up the Bella Centre in Dundee, which holds 16 residents in 3 shared houses. And it supports them to live independently and develop independent living skills, which are reflective of real life. So it feels a million miles away, actually, from women's prisons in England and Wales.
And what would an intelligently and sensitively designed prison look like? In your book, you refer to the architecture of hope. What does that mean in this context?
Yeah, I called my book An Architecture of Hope. And actually, I borrowed the term from Charles Jenks, the architectural theorist who was behind Maggie's cancer care centres. One of the things that really struck me that Charles Jenks said about Maggie's was that in Maggie centres, you create this virtuous circle where staff feel valued. They want to turn up to work in the mornings. And he also talked about how important it was to make people who use Maggie's centres feel like people again, rather than simply patients. And I often say this to architects and people who are designing prisons. What could we do to make prisoners feel like people again, rather than simply prisoners? So I think, I'm very proud of the influence that I've had on the design of our most recently built prisons in England and Wales. There are no bars on the windows, cell windows, for the first time in this country's penal history as a direct result of my research. So I think, that's hopeful. But actually, of course, the vast majority of prisons are known for an architecture of despair. Concrete, razor wire, clanging gates, bars on windows, cracked lino on the floors. In older prisons, very often vermin and rubbish-strewn grounds, no trees, again, no wildlife. New prisons, as I've already said, often resemble sort of warehouses. There's no colour, there's no vividness, there's no opportunity architecturally for curiosity or surprise. And I think the architecture of hope is the opposite of that. It's about light and space, air, the ability to control key elements of the environment, exercise choice and autonomy over the place that people must call home. So in the book, I give the example of Corton Vale Prison, which was the old National Women's Prison in Scotland. And I visited Corton Vale when I was advising the Scottish Prison Service on their new community custody units. And Corton Vale had a terrible reputation. There was a period of time when many suicides took place there. The press dubbed it the Vale of Death and the Vale of Tears. So it was a bleak place, and it was right that it was closed down. But when I visited, it was going through a phase closure, and there was only a small number of prisoners left there. But these women took me into their cells, and they were amazing places. They had domesticated them to an extraordinary degree, really sort of nested in them. I saw lots of beautiful hand-embroidered bedspreads, for example, and cushions and things. But it was the lighting that particularly struck me. So a lot of the women had placed pink and purple tissue paper over the ceiling lights. The ceiling lights were like goldfish bowls and had quite harsh lighting. So the women had placed tissue paper over in order to diffuse the lighting and give it a nice sort of pastel glow. Of course, this was in entire contravention of all health and safety regulations, but staff were turning a blind eye to the fire hazard at that time. And it, it was effective, and it really personalised the cells. And I actually took that example to Limerick Women's Prison, which I advised on the design there. And the architects there took that story, and they actually wanted to fit dimmable lights in the cells, but for technical reasons that wasn't possible. But they gave the women two separate lights with two light switches, so the women could choose either a warm white light or a deep blue light. So during the evenings and at night, many women would have this sort of deep indigo blue light. And just that, just the ability to decide between two different lights, or, to control the ventilation in their room. Those things seem minor to most of us, but actually to people in prison who are stripped of their identities and stripped of, all kind of adult choice making, things like that are incredibly significant.
And when the pros and cons of prison design are discussed, Norwegian prisons are usually hailed as rare successes, and you have referred to them in your book. So why is this? Which aspects of their design are most important in ensuring that they function efficiently and fairly?
Yeah, in Norway, the two prisons that are usually held up as exemplars are Halden Prison, which is in the south of Norway. It's a high security prison, and Bastoy, which is the island prison, an open prison, and you have to take a little ferry across to get to it. Most of the rest of the Norwegian prison estate would be far more recognisable to most of us as, what we would expect conventional prisons to look like. So if you visit Oslo prison, for example, it's not materially very different from a prison like Wormwood Scrubs. But I think in general, there are some things that mark Norwegian prisons out as different and more enlightened. So one extreme example of that would be that they allow conjugal visits, as we still quaintly call them, which doesn't happen in this country. So Halden Prison, for example, has a separate house in the grounds where a prisoner can invite his partner and children to stay for a weekend. And it feels like a kind of quite basic holiday accommodation, I suppose. There's a bedroom for adults, there's a children's bedroom with bunk beds, a little open sort of kitchen area and lounge area, so the prisoner can cook for the family. It's all very normalised, I guess. So that's one example. Another example, I think, would be the trust that's shown in prisoners. So at Halden, for example, again, as a reminder, it's a high security prison. Their sort of mantra is trust begets trust. So they have, every prisoner has his own cell, his own bedroom, but they also have shared open plan accommodation units, which, to be honest, look a bit like an IKEA catalogue. There's a kitchen with a kitchen island with a nice shiny stainless steel dishwasher in it. And then you've got a television and a sofa, dining table and chairs. And in the accommodation units, in the kitchen, there are rows of knives. I mean, rows of kitchen knives, from big carving knife down to sort of paring knife. And they're all on cables. They're all on plastic covered metal cables, which are long enough for the knives to be put into the dishwasher, but not, prisoners can't take the knives out of the building. But they could be used to stab someone. There's no doubt about that. But trust begets trust, and no one's been stabbed yet. Similarly, in the workshops, there are tools on display. In the UK, tools always have to be locked away in cabinets. So things like that, you do notice when you go into Norwegian prisons. But other aspects are more draconian than prisons in the UK. For example, phone calls are monitored. All phone calls are monitored, whereas in this country it tends to be intelligence-led. And that means that if a prisoner and or his family member don't speak Norwegian or English, they can't make phone calls because a member of staff has to be sort of listening in. And so, again, I tell the story in the book about a young man who spent an hour crying in front of me because he'd been inside for 4 years and he'd never been able to speak to his mother, who lives in Istanbul, because she only speaks Turkish. So it's nuanced. I think it would be, inaccurate to say that everything is good about Norwegian prisons and everything is bad about our prisons. But, there's no doubt that if I was an adult male and I had the choice, I'd rather be locked up in Halden Prison than in Pentonville, for example.
And in terms of preventing reoffending and minimising it, enabling people to contribute positively to society and their families once they leave prison, what's the evidence that the Norwegian approach and a more enlightened approach to prison architecture and the design of all the activities there is beneficial?
When we talk about evidence that prison works, for want of a better phrase, we normally look at reoffending rates. And Norway claims a much lower recidivism rate than the UK. So Halden, for example, claims a reoffending rate of around 20 to 25%, whereas in England and Wales, the figure is nearly 50%. This is complicated because it's very difficult to measure, and reoffending rates are measured in different ways in different countries. And, again, I say in An Architecture of Hope, I'm a bit sceptical about some of these reoffending rates, because it's impossible to track over time. 39% of inmates in Halden Prison are foreign nationals, and when they complete their prison sentence, they will be going back to their home countries. So I don't know how you can track that longitudinally and come to any kind of meaningful, accurate figure about whether anyone has reoffended in 12 months' time or 2 years' time or 5 years' time. So that is a problem. And I also, one of the questions that I always ask people I interview in prisons is, what colour is prison? And they always say grey. Nearly always say grey, 99% of the time, I would say. And, at Halden, prisoners also said grey. There were only 3 exceptions to that. One said it was bleak, one said dark, and one said prison is normally grey, but this one is green, I think, which was the most positive response. So the thing that I would really want to emphasise is that a prison is a prison is a prison. Halden, it looks nice to an outsider. It's got a wonderfully designed chapel, multi-faith room. It's got music studios, really well-equipped workshops. It's got a therapeutic garden. But you can see the 25-foot high concrete wall from every bit of the prison. You can't forget that you're in prison. And I think the fact that when prisoners are locked in their cells, there's no door handle on the inside, or, the fact that they can't call their children whenever they want, or they can't just walk out of the gate at 5 o'clock in the way that I can. You can never forget that you're in prison. And the press have dubbed it Hotel Halden, but prisoners that I spoke to there were very keen to emphasise this is not a hotel, it's a prison. And that's the end of it.
And it's still grey, like other prisoners in different prisons felt. So how do these design deficiencies that impede the prison system affect other areas of national incarceration systems?
The prison is the template for the rest of the system, really. So police custody suites, court cells, they all look like prisons. And if we think about children and young people, young offender institutions are very prison-like. There isn't much difference between a YOI and an adult prison. I think a new experiment in children's custody has just opened, and I think it'll be very interesting to see how that fares. It's run by Oasis, who run many successful academies across the country, and it's called Oasis Restore. I talk about it in my book because I advise them on the early master planning. And I think it's interesting because Oasis have set out to do something radically different in the children's estate. They do not want Oasis Restore to look like a prison, which has always been the model. I mean, for secure training centres, which were their predecessor, they look like prisons. Even pupil referral units, schools for excluded children, have many of the attributes of prison institutions. But Oasis are trying to do something different. And the children who will live there, I think there are only about 5 there at the moment, but they'll be aged 12 to 17, I think. And they will live together in small units. The bedrooms that they'll be in are cosy and personalised. I showed the architects images of high-end student halls of residence to try and inspire them. And the rooms will have sofa beds. They've got attractive workstations, plenty of homely touches. But the problem for Oasis was that they were hampered by the building they inherited, which was the old Medway Secure Training Centre, which was a very notorious place. You may remember there was a BBC Panorama expose of Medway, which uncovered shocking levels of staff brutality, staff assaults on the children held there. So Oasis have got the best of intentions, they really have. And I have a lot of goodwill towards them. I really wish them all the best. But they've inherited this building which has trauma in the walls. And they're up against it, really. Not only do they have to answer to the Ministry of Justice, but also Ofsted. And Ofsted are very risk averse. So again, in my book, I talk about the gardens there. One nice feature of the site is that there's lots of green space. But Ofsted wanted them to put 14-foot high steel fences to keep the children separated from each other. So in effect, they were trying to create lots and lots of little mini prisons within the prison. And I was asked to provide evidence to Oasis that they could go to Ofsted and say this was a bad idea. But, really trying to keep children separated from each other takes us right back to the 19th century separate system. I understand that they were being advised by an architect who had previously worked in the adult prison estate. But it was all about security and all about being risk averse rather than quality of life and forming healthy relationships and teaching children how to socialise with each other.
And as you've explained so eloquently, the problems of our prison and incarceration systems are deeply damaging for our societies, for local communities. Do you have any reason to feel confident that there's a political will, that their long-term deficiencies can be corrected, and we have a system that's fit for purpose?
I often say that the thing that we really need to do is halve the prison population. We lock up too many people for too long a length of time in over-securitized conditions. And that does none of us any good because, let's face it, the vast majority of people in prison will come out at some point and they will be our neighbours. And who do we want living next door to us or, sitting on the bus next to our daughters? Someone who's been brutalised and alienated, including by the architecture that they've been living in, or someone who has been rehabilitated and feels that they have an investment in their future and in the future of society. I have a chapter in my book on dirty work, and rather controversially, I say that it's an accusation that could be thrown at prison architects. There's been a big debate about this in the United States. I met an architect in San Francisco called Raphael Sperry, who leads an activist group that lobbies for architecture practices to turn down prison contracts and doesn't believe in trying to make prisons more beautiful environments. That's not part of the debate for him. And he's had some success in this, but the reality is that most architects say that they can't afford to turn down potentially lucrative contracts. And that if they don't compete for the contract with all their enlightened ideas and their knowledge about rehabilitation, then someone else who's less enlightened and less knowledgeable about prisons might win the contract. And this has been called the moral problem of worse actors. And it troubles me a little bit because I tell myself the same. When I'm asked to get involved in a consortium's bid for a new prison, I think, well, it's better that I'm there than not, with my criminology expertise and my knowledge of prisons and prisoners. But in the book, I ask myself, am I also engaged in dirty work? Am I getting my hands dirty? But I think the real ethical murkiness for me lies in the bigger picture that you've alluded to. So it's the political context. And I think as a society, we need to really be addressing this and asking ourselves some searching questions about what prisons are for and who we send to prison. And it's only really, I think, when politicians either end up in prison themselves or have a relative that goes to prison that they start really addressing some of these questions. Aside from that, I think most politicians view prisoners as others, almost like a different species. They ignore the fact that most prisoners land up in prison due to social problems and economic problems of their making, of the politicians' making. And I think, I give a few examples in my book of prisons that I've been involved in, and I've worked with some really good architects who have been imaginative, compassionate, knowledgeable people. And sometimes we've come up with a design that I believe would be genuinely transformative for the lives of the people who live and work in those facilities. But we haven't been able to account for what would happen next. And in these, quite punitive political cultures, it's often very difficult to come up with a design that is actually civilized and would be regarded as humane and progressive, let alone imaginative. So I give a number of examples of sorry tales. When a correction department looks at the master plan and gets cold feet, or when a country's harsh sentencing policy results in a well-designed prison being utterly compromised by overcrowding. And, Limerick is the prison that I'm most proud of being involved in, Limerick Women's Prison. But it only opened a year ago and it's already operating at 141% capacity. There are women sleeping on camp beds in it. So, that mitigates against all the good design cues. And to me, it's just inhuman.
Yvonne, you have had a remarkable career and you've done some extraordinary research into prisons, which everyone can read about in An Architecture of Hope. And the book has had a big impact in taking your ideas to a wider audience. So what are you working on now?
I'm still working as a design consultant on prison contract bids. I'm increasingly focusing on trauma-informed design and design for mental health. I've also started writing another book. It's a project with a serving prisoner, someone who's serving a long sentence for armed robbery. And we're telling his story, the story of his life, in collaboration. He is a talented writer. He's a sort of semi-professional journalist. He writes a regular column for the prison newspaper, Inside Time. So, that's an exciting project. His name's Nick, and he's recently been moved to a Category D open prison, which was originally built as a hospital for US Air Force during World War II. So it opened as a prison in 1948. And from what he tells me, I don't think it's a prison that, in terms of the building, is fit for purpose at all. I was recently involved in the early planning of a bid for a contract to build new open prisons. And I talk about this in the book. But the MOJ has never had to design open prisons before because all our open prisons are ex-military buildings or ex-stately homes or ex-mental asylums. And there's a real resistance, I think, within government to building prisons that are actually resettlement prisons. I think, the basic fundamental concept of a resettlement prison isn't really understood. So I think we need to be much more imaginative and progressive when it comes to prison design. Architects need to embody their designs. When I worked on Limerick, one of the questions that I asked of architects is, would you be confident that if a relative of yours was imprisoned here, they would not only be safe and treated decently, but they could thrive and flourish? And that was a question that they'd never thought to ask themselves, these architects. So that was quite a moment. And I think it was Henry Ford who said, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And in the case of prisons, that's high rates of mental illness, self-harm, suicide, drug abuse, overcrowding, and recidivism. And I think An Architecture of Hope would be conceived for a much smaller prison population than we currently have. And it would be based on values such as empathy, healing, understanding, regrowth, renewal, and of course, hope.
Well, Yvonne, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. It's been fascinating to listen to you. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. You can find images of Yvonne's work on our Instagram feed at design.emergency. And in the hope of making Design Emergency more accessible, we've added alt text for people with visual impairments and a transcript of each episode, which you can access using the link in our bio. We look forward to welcoming you back to Design Emergency very soon, when we'll be talking to another global design leader who, like Yvonne Jewkes, is forging positive change. Goodbye, and thank you, Yvonne.
Thank you.